The village library was a small, unassuming building tucked away on a quiet side street with large wooden doors that creaked as Amal gently pushed one open. She slipped inside, eager for the silence and comfort that the rows of books provided. The scent of old paper and ink filled the space, calming her as she moved through the narrow aisles, trailing her fingers over the spines of countless books. The world outside felt so noisy, so turbulent with thoughts and emotions she couldn't escape. But here, within these walls, there was a calm that washed over her, allowing her mind to breathe. Amal found herself drawn to a small reading nook near the back of the library. Light filtered through a dusty window, casting warm, amber tones over the pages of a worn book she had pulled from the shelf. She sank into a cushioned chair, tucking her feet beneath her, and opened the book, letting her gaze wander over the faded text. Words became images in her mind, and she felt herself being transported into the stories of distant lands and forgotten times. Here, surrounded by tales of people who had lived and loved long ago, she could almost forget her own restless thoughts. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional turn of a page, the faint whisper of footsteps on the wooden floor, and the creak of bookshelves settling into the building's ancient frame. It was in one of these rare moments, as she shifted slightly to find a more comfortable position, that she noticed a familiar presence. At first she thought it was her mind playing tricks on her, conjuring a figure she had thought of often in the past days. She resisted the urge to look, telling herself she was mistaken, that it was impossible for him to be here, of all places at this exact moment. But the pull was irresistible. Slowly, as if in a dream, Amal lifted her gaze, peeking over the top of her book, and her breath caught in her throat. There, just a few shelves away, Kofi stood, his back to her, his broad shoulders framed by the soft light from the window. He was reaching for a book on a high shelf, his fingers brushing over the worn covers as he browsed with a quiet concentration. She felt a pang in her chest, an ache that had become so familiar, so much a part of her, that she hardly noticed it anymore. In the stillness she watched him, her gaze tracing the curve of his profile as he turned slightly, flipping through the pages of a book he had pulled down. His brow furrowed in that quiet, thoughtful way she had come to recognize, a small gesture that spoke of his love for the details, for the small, quiet moments that others often overlooked. She found herself captivated, unable to look away, her mind filling with memories of fleeting glances, shared silences and unspoken words that lingered between them like shadows. For a moment she thought of leaving, of quietly slipping away before he noticed her. But something held her in place, some quiet, powerful force that kept her rooted to her chair. She knew she couldn't keep avoiding him forever, couldn't keep pretending that what she felt was nothing more than a passing fancy. The feelings that had taken root in her heart had grown into something more, something she couldn't easily dismiss or ignore. And so she remained, allowing herself the luxury of this brief, stolen moment. At last Kofi's gaze lifted, his eyes scanning the room before they settled on her. His expression softened, a slight surprise flickering across his face before it was replaced by a look of understanding, of shared recognition. There were no words, no smiles, only a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them, a silent understanding that seemed to bridge the space that separated them. Amal felt her heart beat faster, her hands clutching the edges of her book as she held his gaze. He moved toward her, his steps slow and measured, as if he too were savoring this unexpected encounter. She watched him approach, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread, her mind racing with questions she knew she would never voice. When he finally stopped, it was at a respectful distance, his presence close enough to fill the air around her with a warmth that she could feel, even without him touching her. Kofi's gaze fell to the book in her hands, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he recognized the title. She felt her cheeks flush, a quiet embarrassment blooming within her, though she couldn't say why. He gestured toward the chair across from her, a silent question in his eyes, and she nodded, her heart thudding in her chest as he settled into the seat opposite her. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence between them was rich, filled with all the things they couldn't say, with feelings that hovered on the edge of words but never fully emerged. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the quiet intensity of his presence, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She lowered her eyes, focusing on the pages in front of her, though the words blurred into meaningless shapes as her mind became acutely aware of the man sitting across from her. Kofi turned a page of his own book, the soft rustle breaking the stillness between them, but he didn't look up. There was something calming in the way he remained there, content to simply share the space with her, to exist within the same quiet moment without the need for conversation. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a comfort in the simplicity of his presence, in the way they could sit together in silence without the need to fill the air with meaningless words. Her thoughts drifted as she studied the lines of his face, the way his eyes traced the text before him with a focus that belied the softness in his expression. She wondered what thoughts filled his mind, what emotions lay beneath the calm exterior he presented to the world. She wished for just a moment that she could reach across the space between them, that she could bridge the quiet gulf that separated them, and ask him all the questions that lingered in her heart. But she knew that some things were better left unspoken, that some feelings were too fragile, too precious to be exposed to the harshness of reality. And so she remained silent, allowing herself the simple pleasure of this moment, of sitting across from him in the quiet sanctuary of the library, with only the gentle rustle of pages to break the stillness. As time passed, the light outside began to soften, casting warm shadows across the room, and she felt the weight of the day settle over her, a quiet sense of contentment filling her heart. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know where life would lead her or what choices she would ultimately make. But in this moment, in the soft light of the library, she felt a sense of peace, a gentle acceptance of the connection that bound her to him, even if they would never speak of it aloud. When Kofi finally closed his book, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that sent a shiver through her. There was no need for words, no need for confessions or promises. In that brief glance, she felt as if he had seen straight into her heart, as if he understood the depth of her feelings without the need for explanation. She held his gaze, her own eyes filled with a quiet vulnerability, a silent acknowledgement of all that lay between them. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, he rose from his seat, giving her one last lingering look before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadowed aisles of the library. She watched him go, her heart heavy and light at the same time, a quiet ache settling within her as she realized that this moment, like so many before it, was fleeting, a brief encounter in a life filled with unspoken emotions and silent connections. Amala remained in her seat long after he had gone, her gaze drifting to the empty chair across from her, a wistful smile touching her lips. She knew that this moment, this quiet, stolen memory, would remain with her, a secret treasure that she would carry in her heart, a quiet reminder of the bond they shared, a bond that defied explanation and transcended words. In the fading light of the library, Amal felt a sense of peace settle over her, a gentle acceptance of the love that would linger between them, a love that needed no words, no promises, only the quiet, unspoken connection that would remain with her, even as the world around her continued to change. Late in the evening, the storm raged over the village, a fierce, unrelenting force that sent the residents rushing indoors and windows slamming shut against the gusting wind. Rain fell in torrents, the drops heavy and cold, drenching the earth and creating rivulets that carved their way through the streets. Amal had found shelter at the village inn, a cozy, rustic building with thick stone walls and a hearth that crackled with warmth. She hadn't planned to be here tonight, but the storm had come on suddenly, catching her just as she was about to leave the village centre. Now, she stood in the quiet corner of the inn's lounge, her shawl soaked and clinging to her skin, her heart still racing from the sprint to safety. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, golden light that flickered over the worn leather chairs and the wooden tables scattered throughout the room. She removed her shawl, draping it over the back of a nearby chair to dry, and smoothed her hair with trembling fingers, feeling the lingering chill of the rain clinging to her skin. Despite the warmth of the fire, A shiver ran down her spine, an inexplicable tension lingering in the air. The inn was almost empty, save for a few travellers huddled in conversation near the bar, their voices low against the steady drumbeat of rain against the windows. Amal took a seat near the fire, pulling her knees up to her chest and letting the warmth seep into her bones. She had just begun to relax when the door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. She looked up, her eyes widening as she saw him. Kofi stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the rain-soaked night. His clothes were damp, his hair clinging to his forehead, and his gaze scanned the room before settling on her. For a moment neither of them moved, each caught off guard by the unexpected encounter. Her heart raced, her pulse thrumming in her veins as he took a step forward, his presence filling the small space with an intensity that was almost palpable. Without a word, Kofi moved to the chair beside hers, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he too were feeling the weight of the moment. He sank into the seat, his eyes never leaving hers, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. The silence hung heavy, charged with an electricity that was almost tangible, a current that seemed to crackle in the air between them. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the thunder rolling across the sky like a distant drum, the lightning illuminating the room in brief flashes of white light. Amal could feel the heat of the fire warming her, mingling with the warmth radiating from Kofi's proximity, creating a sensation that was both soothing and exhilarating. She felt her pulse quicken, her breath catching as she became acutely aware of every detail, the way the light danced over his skin, the glint of moisture on his jawline, the quiet intensity in his gaze. Kofi leaned back, his gaze still fixed on her, his presence steady and grounding, yet there was something different tonight. A softness in his eyes, a quiet vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. She felt her own defenses slipping, the walls she had carefully constructed to protect her heart beginning to crumble under the weight of his gaze. She turned her face toward the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she tried to steady her breath, to calm the wild flutter of her heart. But the silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing moment, until it became almost unbearable. She could feel his gaze on her, feel the warmth of his body mere inches away, and yet the distance between them felt insurmountable, a chasm that she couldn't bring herself to cross. She didn't dare look at him, didn't dare let him see the longing that had taken root within her heart, a longing that she could no longer deny, no matter how hard she tried. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the air, and Amal felt a warmth that went beyond the physical, a heat that seemed to burn through her, igniting something deep within her soul. She stole a glance at him, her gaze lingering on the curve of his mouth, the way his hand rested on the arm of the chair, strong and steady, yet softened by the golden light. Without thinking, her hand moved, her fingers reaching out, hesitant but compelled, as if drawn by an invisible force. She barely brushed the edge of his sleeve, the fabric damp and cool beneath her fingertips, but the touch was enough to send a shiver through her. Kofi's gaze darkened, his eyes following the movement of her hand, a flicker of something raw and unguarded passing over his features. He reached up, his fingers grazing hers in a touch so light it felt almost like a whisper, a question, a confession that neither of them could put into words. She didn't pull away, couldn't bring herself to break the fragile connection between them. Her hand lingered on his, her fingers tracing a gentle line along his knuckles, feeling the roughness of his skin, the quiet strength in his grip. She knew this was dangerous, knew that they were treading a line they could never cross, but in that moment she didn't care. All that mattered was the warmth of his hand beneath hers, the way his gaze held hers with a fierce, unspoken intensity. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howling against the windows, as if echoing the turmoil within her heart. Kofi's hand tightened around hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, a quiet promise, a vow unspoken yet understood. She felt her breath hitch, her heart pounding as he leaned closer, his gaze never wavering, his presence filling her senses, consuming her in a way that left her dizzy, breathless. In the flickering light of the fire, their faces were mere inches apart, their breaths mingling in the small space that separated them. Amal felt her eyes close, surrendering to the sensation of his warmth, his presence, the quiet strength of his touch. She felt his hand move to her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over her skin, a touch so gentle it sent a shiver down her spine, a warmth that seemed to seep into her very soul. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a vulnerability she couldn't hide, a raw honesty that she had kept buried for so long. In that moment there was no need for words, no need for explanations or justifications. They were simply two souls, bound by a connection that defied reason, a bond that existed beyond the boundaries of their lives, beyond the expectations and responsibilities that held them apart. His gaze softened, his lips curving into a small, almost sad smile as he held her face in his hands, his touch steady and grounding. She felt her own resolve waver, felt the weight of her emotions pressing down on her, the ache in her heart growing stronger, more insistent, as she realized just how much he meant to her, how deeply he had become a part of her life. Without a word, Kofi leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss so soft, so tender, it felt like a dream. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the warmth of his embrace, to the quiet intensity of his touch. The world around them faded into silence, the storm outside a distant murmur as they lost themselves in each other, in the warmth and comfort of a connection that felt both forbidden and inevitable. They pulled away slowly, their foreheads resting against each other as they caught their breath, their hands still intertwined, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the storm. Amal felt a tear slip down her cheek, a mixture of joy and sorrow, of longing and acceptance, as she realized that this moment, this brief stolen memory, would remain with her forever, a quiet treasure hidden deep within her heart. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's presence, a silent acknowledgement of the love that lingered between them, a love that needed no words, no promises, only the quiet understanding that they would carry this moment with them. A secret shared only by the flickering light of the fire and the storm that raged outside. As the storm began to ease, the rain slowing to a gentle patter against the windows, Kofi released her hand, his gaze lingering on her face, a quiet sadness in his eyes. She felt a pang in her heart, a bittersweet ache, as he rose from his seat, his movements slow and reluctant, as if he too felt the weight of their parting. Without a word he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the inn, leaving her alone by the fire, her heart heavy yet filled with a quiet, fierce joy. She knew that this love, this connection, was something rare, something precious, something that would remain with her, no matter where life took her. As the fire crackled softly in the quiet of the inn, Amal leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of the flames wash over her, a silent reminder of the love that had touched her heart, a love that would linger, hidden yet cherished, for all the days to come. The morning sun had barely risen, casting a soft, silvery light over the forest path as Amal stepped into its embrace. The world was quiet, still wrapped in the tranquility of dawn, with only the occasional bird calling out through the trees. She walked slowly, her steps muffled by the soft carpet of leaves beneath her feet, her senses attuned to the subtle sounds around her, the rustling of leaves, the gentle hum of a breeze, the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. The forest had always been a place of peace for Amal, a sanctuary where she could lose herself among the ancient trees and escape the weight of her daily life. But today something felt different. There was an energy in the air, a quiet anticipation that seemed to pulse through the trees and linger in the morning mist. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the earthy scent of damp soil and moss, letting the calm of the forest seep into her. As she rounded a bend in the path, a figure emerged from the mist ahead. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the tall, familiar silhouette standing among the trees, his gaze already fixed on her. Kofi. It was as if he had been waiting for her, drawn here by the same invisible thread that had guided her steps to this place. For a moment, neither of them moved, each caught in the quiet intensity of the other's gaze. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the leaves stilling, the air thickening around them as they stood there, separated by only a few paces but connected by something deeper, something that defied explanation. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, Amal took a step forward. She felt her heart racing, her pulse quickening with each step, the warmth of his presence pulling her closer, filling her senses with a heady mix of anticipation and longing. She hadn't expected to see him here, hadn't prepared herself for the effect his presence would have on her, but there was no turning back now. Kofi held her gaze, his eyes dark and intense, his expression unreadable yet filled with a quiet magnetic pull that left her breathless. She could feel the warmth of him, sense the steady strength in his stance, and yet there was a softness in his face, a vulnerability that tugged at something deep within her. They stood facing each other in silence, the world around them fading into the background as their eyes locked. She felt as if he could see straight into her heart, straight into the secret corners of her soul, where she had hidden her feelings, her desires, her fears. It was both thrilling and terrifying, this sense of being seen, of being known, and yet she couldn't look away. Without thinking, she lifted her hand, reaching out to touch him, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric of his shirt. The contact sent a spark through her, a surge of warmth that spread through her body, igniting something she had kept buried for too long. She felt his hand cover hers, his fingers warm and steady against her skin, grounding her, anchoring her in the reality of this moment. He didn't speak, didn't break the silence that enveloped them, but his gaze held 1,000 unspoken words, a quiet promise that echoed in the depths of his eyes. She felt her breath catch as he drew her closer, his hand moving to rest gently on her shoulder, his touch a silent reassurance, a steadying force amidst the rush of emotions swirling within her. Amal closed her eyes, surrendering to the warmth of his touch, the strength in his embrace, allowing herself to be held, to be seen, to be cherished in a way she had never allowed herself before. She could feel his breath on her skin, warm and soft, sending a shiver down her spine as he leaned closer, his presence filling her senses, consuming her in a way that left her dizzy, breathless. They stood there, entwined in the stillness of the forest, their breaths mingling in the cool morning air, their bodies pressed close, fitting together as if they had been made for this moment, this quiet embrace. She could feel his heart beating in time with hers, a steady rhythm that grounded her, that reminded her of the strength, the comfort, the quiet intensity that he brought into her life. As if sensing her thoughts, Kofi's hand moved, his fingers brushing lightly along her jawline, tracing a gentle path that left a trail of warmth in its wake. She felt herself leaning into his touch, her own hands resting on his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingers. There was a tenderness in his gaze, a quiet, unspoken affection that filled her with a fierce, aching joy. She didn't need words, didn't need explanations or promises. In his touch, in the quiet strength of his embrace, she found everything she needed, a silent reassurance that they were bound by something deeper, something unbreakable. She felt his lips press softly against her forehead, a gentle kiss that sent a wave of warmth through her, filling her heart with a quiet, fierce happiness that left her breathless. They stood together in the morning light, wrapped in each other's arms, their bodies pressed close, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the forest. Amal felt a peace settle over her, a calm that went beyond words, a sense of belonging that she had never felt before. She knew that this moment would remain with her, a quiet memory that would linger in her heart, a reminder of the connection that had brought them together, a bond that would endure no matter where life took them. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm, golden light over them, Amal lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes with a smile that was both tender and fierce. She felt a surge of gratitude, a quiet joy that filled her heart as she realized that, no matter what lay ahead, she would carry this moment with her, a memory etched into her soul. They lingered in each other's embrace, wrapped in the warmth of the morning, the quiet strength of their connection, a love that needed no words, only the silent understanding that bound them together, forever entwined in the beauty of the forest and the dawn of a new day. The evening festival by the lake was alive with color and laughter, a celebration that filled the air with music and the warm glow of lanterns hanging from tree branches. Their light cast dancing reflections across the water, painting a vivid tapestry that shifted with every ripple and wave. Amal stood at the edge of the lake, taking it all in, the joyful voices, the clinking of glasses, the soft strumming of a guitar in the distance. Yet, in the midst of it all, she felt a familiar restlessness, a quiet ache that seemed to pulse beneath the surface, an anticipation that had settled into her very bones. She turned, feeling her heart skip as she saw Kofi standing just a few steps away, his figure silhouetted against the lake, his face softened in the warm glow of the festival lights. His gaze was already on her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, an invitation unspoken but undeniable. For a moment she forgot the crowd around them, forgot the music, the laughter, everything but the intensity of his presence, the magnetic pull that had drawn her to him over and over again. Without a word, he gestured toward a quieter spot near the lake's edge, a secluded corner where the music faded to a distant hum, and the shadows fell in soft, gentle patterns over the grass. She followed him, her heart pounding as they walked side by side, their fingers brushing in a subtle, electric touch that sent a thrill through her, setting her nerves alight. When they reached the edge of the water, Kofi stopped, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the lake stretching out before them. The air was cool, a faint breeze drifting over the surface of the water, carrying with it the scent of night-blooming flowers. Amal felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of the evening chill and the undeniable warmth radiating from his presence. They stood in silence, their breaths mingling in the cool air, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Amal felt the weight of his gaze on her, the intensity of his eyes as they traced her face, her shoulders, the curve of her arm. She felt exposed, vulnerable under the quiet power of his attention, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. There was a hunger in his gaze, a quiet yearning that mirrored her own, a desire that simmered just beneath the surface. Kofi reached for her hand, his touch light, almost tentative, as if testing the boundaries of the moment. She felt his fingers entwine with hers, a warmth that spread through her, anchoring her, grounding her in the reality of his presence. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow as he pulled her closer, his hand finding its way to her waist, a steady, comforting touch that sent a thrill through her, igniting a heat that had lingered in her heart for too long. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, their faces mere inches apart, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. She could feel his heartbeat against hers, a steady rhythm that echoed the intensity of her own, a silent confession that needed no words. The world around them faded into silence, leaving only the warmth of his body pressed against hers, the quiet strength of his embrace, the undeniable pull that had drawn them together time and again. Slowly, as if unable to resist, Kofi leaned closer, his lips brushing against her forehead in a tender, lingering kiss that sent a shiver through her. His touch was gentle, reverent, filled with a tenderness that took her breath away, a quiet promise that echoed in the depth of his gaze. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the warmth of his embrace, to the quiet intensity of his touch, letting herself be swept away in the depth of her feelings, the fierce joy that filled her heart. They stood together by the lake, wrapped in the warmth of the evening, the beauty of the festival fading into the background as they lost themselves in each other, in the quiet magic of the night, in a connection that defied words, that needed no explanations. Only the silent understanding that bound them together, a bond as deep and enduring as the lake itself. The village courtyard was bathed in silver moonlight, the only illumination against the deep, inky darkness of midnight. Amal walked slowly, her footsteps echoing softly over the cobblestone path. She had come here for solitude, for the quiet that only these late hours could bring, hoping the chill night air would soothe the unrest that had lingered within her all evening. The courtyard was empty, silent except for the whisper of leaves rustling in the faint breeze, their shadows shifting like delicate lace patterns over the walls. But as she moved deeper into the courtyard, she sensed she wasn't alone. She halted, a familiar, undeniable presence reaching her even before she saw him. Kofi stepped out from the shadows of a nearby archway, his tall figure bathed in moonlight, his gaze intense and steady as it met hers. The air between them thickened, a quiet current flowing, an energy that seemed to stir the night itself. For a moment neither of them moved, their eyes locked in a gaze that held more weight than any words could carry. Amal felt her breath catch, her heart racing as he took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, each one heightening the pulse she felt deep within her chest. She had been searching for peace, yet his presence stirred something entirely different, a warmth that crept into her bones, igniting a fire she couldn't ignore. Kofi stopped just inches away, his gaze holding hers, a quiet intensity simmering behind his dark eyes. The silence stretched between them, fraught with the unspoken, with the desires they had buried for so long. Amal felt the cool night air wrap around them, a contrast to the heat radiating from his presence, an energy that seemed to bind them together in a way that words could never capture. Slowly he lifted a hand, his fingers grazing her cheek with a touch so gentle it felt like a whisper against her skin. She felt herself lean into his touch, her eyes closing as his thumb brushed over her cheekbone, a silent reassurance, a quiet confession of all he could not say. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow, the simple act of his touch unraveling the restraint she had held for so long. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze once more, and in that moment everything else faded away, the village, the courtyard, the world itself. There was only the two of them, standing together under the moonlight, bound by a connection that defied explanation, that existed beyond the bounds of reason. Without a word, Kofi slipped his hand to the nape of her neck, pulling her closer until their foreheads touched. She could feel his breath, warm against her skin, mingling with hers, their breaths falling into a shared rhythm. The moment felt fragile, a delicate balance between the desires they both felt and the boundaries they knew they couldn't cross. But in that moment, boundaries felt inconsequential, lost in the pull that held them together. Amal's hand found its way to his chest, her fingers splayed against the warmth of his skin, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The intimacy of the touch, the closeness of their bodies, left her breathless, every fibre of her being attuned to him, to the quiet strength in his embrace. She felt his heartbeat quicken beneath her touch, a silent confirmation of the effect she had on him, a reminder that he felt it too, this pull, this connection that had haunted her every thought. Kofi's lips brushed her temple, a feather-like touch that sent a shiver through her, a thrill that spread through her entire being. He moved slowly, his lips tracing a path down to her cheek, lingering near the corner of her mouth in a touch that was both tender and agonizingly restrained. She felt herself leaning into him, her own breath catching as he hesitated, the weight of their unspoken desires filling the silence between them. But even as he held her close, his hand cradling her face, his lips hovering just inches from hers, there was a quiet restraint in his touch, a silent respect that kept him from crossing the final line. Amal felt both grateful and aching, her heart caught between the desire to surrender to him fully and the knowledge of the boundaries they both held so carefully. For a long moment they simply stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, their breaths mingling in the cool night air, their bodies pressed close. She could feel the heat of him, the steady, grounding strength of his embrace, and yet there was a fragility to the moment, a sense that this was something precious, something to be cherished. Finally, Kofi pulled back slightly, his hand lingering on her face as he looked at her with a gaze that held all the words he would never speak. She saw the same struggle in his eyes, the same yearning tempered by restraint, and it filled her with a fierce, bittersweet joy. As he took a step back, his hand slipping from her cheek, she felt the chill of the night settle over her once more, a reminder of the world outside this moment. But even as the distance grew between them, she knew that something had changed, that the memory of his touch, his gaze, his quiet strength would stay with her, a warmth that would linger long after the midnight shadows had faded. Amal watched him disappear into the darkness, her heart filled with both longing and peace, a quiet certainty that, no matter where life took them, this moment, this connection, would remain with her forever, a love unspoken yet understood. A bond as steady and unyielding as the moonlit courtyard that had borne witness to their silent embrace. The train station was alive with movement, a bustling hive of people coming and going, their hurried steps echoing off the worn, tile floors. The air was filled with the smell of metal and oil, punctuated by the low hum of conversations and the occasional sharp whistle of a train. Amal stood at the edge of the platform, her gaze fixed on the steel tracks stretching out into the distance. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a weight pressing down on her as she waited, struggling to keep her emotions in check. And then she saw him. Kofi moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence, his tall frame cutting a path as people brushed past him, none noticing the intensity in his gaze as he sought her out. When their eyes met, it felt as if the whole world fell away, the noise, the movement, everything dissolving until only the two of them remained. He approached slowly, his face calm but his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that left her breathless. They stood there, side by side, the cool morning air swirling around them, filled with the scent of coal and the faint warmth of sunlight filtering through the haze. He glanced down at his ticket, clutched tightly in his hand, and Amal felt a pang in her heart, a sharp reminder that this moment was all they had left. The silence between them was thick, heavy with all the things they could never say, with feelings that had been left unspoken for too long. Amal wanted to speak, to reach out and tell him all the things she had held inside, but her throat tightened, her words caught somewhere between her heart and her lips. She felt his gaze on her, felt the quiet intensity that had always been there, a presence that both comforted and broke her in equal measure. Slowly, Kofi extended his hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a touch so light it sent a shiver through her. The warmth of his skin against hers, the strength in his gentle grasp, was almost too much to bear. She felt herself tremble, her own fingers tightening around his as if trying to anchor herself, to hold on to this fleeting moment that would soon slip away. They didn't speak, didn't exchange empty words or hollow promises. Instead, they stood there, their hands entwined, their eyes locked in a gaze that held all the emotions they couldn't express. Amal felt her heart breaking and mending all at once, a fierce, desperate love surging within her, mingling with the sorrow and the finality of this goodbye. The train whistle blew, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the air, signaling the end of their time together. She could feel the vibrations beneath her feet as the train drew closer, a physical reminder that this moment was slipping away, that he was slipping away. Her breath caught, her heart pounding as she tried to commit every detail to memory, the warmth of his touch, the depth in his gaze, the way he held her hand with a tenderness that spoke of promises made in silence. Without thinking, Amal lifted her free hand, her fingers brushing against his cheek, a feather-like touch that left her heart aching. Kofi closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaping his lips. She felt his hand cover hers, pressing it gently against his skin, a silent plea, a wordless confession that mirrored the longing in her own heart. The train's rumble grew louder, the sound filling the station, but they remained rooted in place, lost in each other, lost in the quiet intensity of the moment. She felt his fingers trail up her arm, grazing her skin in a touch so soft it felt like a whisper, a promise, a memory that would stay with her long after he had gone. Her heart raced, her body alive with the warmth of his touch, with the fire he ignited within her. Kofi opened his eyes, his gaze holding hers with a fierce determination, a quiet strength that left her breathless. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool air, the only sound between them the steady rhythm of their hearts. Amal felt herself drawn to him, a magnetic pull that defied reason, a connection that was as deep and unbreakable as the love she had kept hidden in the shadows of her heart. In that final, fragile moment, his lips brushed against hers, a kiss so gentle, so filled with yearning that it left her dizzy, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and sorrow. The kiss deepened, their lips moving together in a dance that was both fierce and tender, a release of all the emotions they had kept locked away, a goodbye that spoke of love and loss, of longing and hope. The train's whistle sounded again, a harsh reminder that time was slipping away, that they couldn't stay here, wrapped in each other's arms, lost in a moment that felt both eternal and heartbreakingly brief. Kofi pulled back, his hand lingering on her face, his gaze filled with a quiet sadness, a tenderness that left her breathless. She could see her own reflection in his eyes, the same sorrow, the same longing mirrored back at her. As he stepped back, Amal felt the emptiness settle over her, a hollow ache where his warmth had been, a silence that was almost deafening. She watched him board the train, his figure blending into the crowd, her heart breaking with each step he took. She wanted to call out, to reach for him. But the words wouldn't come, her voice caught in her throat, her heart too heavy with the weight of their goodbye. The train's engine roared to life, a final, unyielding reminder that this was the end, that he was leaving, taking with him a piece of her heart that she would never get back. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the window where he sat, his eyes meeting hers one last time, a silent farewell passing between them. As the train began to move, Amal felt a tear slip down her cheek, a single drop that carried the weight of her love, her sorrow, her longing. She raised her hand in a final wave, a small, fragile gesture that felt like a lifeline, a thread connecting them across the distance that grew with each passing second. He raised his hand in response, his fingers pressed against the glass, a mirror of her own, a silent promise that he would carry her memory with him wherever he went. The train pulled away, disappearing into the horizon, leaving only the echo of its whistle and the emptiness that filled the station. Amal stood alone, the cool morning air wrapping around her, a silent witness to the love she had lost, the love she would carry with her, forever etched into her heart. As the platform emptied, as the noise faded into silence, she turned and walked away, her steps slow and steady, her heart heavy yet filled with a quiet strength. She knew that, no matter how much time passed, no matter how far life took them, this love, this moment, would remain with her, a memory that would warm her heart on the coldest days, a reminder of the connection that had transcended words, a love that was as deep and enduring as the endless tracks stretching out into the unknown.